Hi, everybody. Welcome back to Learning Impact 2021. We're on day 3. I hope you've managed to take advantage of some of the many great sessions that we've had so far, but also remember, if you haven't been able to, they're all being recorded for you. So you'll have a chance to look at them. And we'll also in IMS be pointing you to some of the highlights and so forth. We're here right now for what I believe should be a very interesting panel on the current and future directions for, the software that today is widely known as the LMS or Learning Management System. We've got kind of a higher ed focus right now, but certainly in higher ed, the LMS is the dominant access point now for most learning tools and digital resources. It has been for quite some number of years now. LMSs are also seeing some growth now in K-12. Now, as many of you know, there's been quite a lot of interest in the topic of, how this very, very important category of products, has become one of the most used systems in higher ed, and certainly in the pandemic, became just a mainstay. But there's been a flurry of activity. Even before the activity, a few years back, there was a project in EDUCAUSE called the NGDLE, which some folks called the worst acronym in the world, but it stood for Next Generation Digital Learning Environment, really kind of all about where should all of this be going. And we know from our interaction with higher ed institutions that folks are very interested in where this is going. So especially now as things maybe get more back to normal, we'll be focusing in more on the future of the LMS. And so to explore this topic, we have 3 veteran supplier representatives. They're all stars in their own right, but surprisingly, only one is representing an actual LMS, supplier in terms of the kind of the LMS that's, the well-known LMSs of Blackboard and Canvas and D2L and so forth. But the other participants on our panel are going to shed a lot of light because the purpose of the evolution of learning environments has as much to do with learning tools and resources as the LMS software itself. So I'd like to go ahead and introduce our panel now. We'll say hello to each one of them. Our first panelist is George Moore, who's the Chief Technology Officer at Cengage. Hi, George. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great, Rob. Thanks for having me.
All right. Thank you for being here. Tim Tomlinson, who's the Chief Product Officer for Blackboard. Hello, Tim.
Rob, looking forward to the conversation.
Okay, great to have you. And Andrew Alfers, who's the Vice President for Product Management at VitalSource. Hi, Andrew.
Hey, Rob. Hey, everyone. Pleased to be here and looking forward to the discussion.
All right, great. So the first question might be a little bit of a softball question, but it's probably important for the audience to get a sense if they don't already know. And that's really during the pandemic, we knew there was a lot of use of digital products and a lot of fast movement to getting use of digital products. I thought it would be interesting to the audience just to start out for each of you to talk a bit about how the pandemic affected the scale of adoption of each of your products. Just think that would be good background from which we can build. Who'd like to take that first?
I'll start from the content perspective. We had, when the pandemic hit, about 50% of our customers are deeply using digital tools pre-pandemic. That first week, we set up 38,000 new courses and registered 1 million new students on our systems in a week. So it was clear that the wave hit us, and we also opened up our solutions to be free during that time, and so that kind of pushed things forward. So what we've seen since then, it's I've always described it as the pandemic pushed those late arrivers of digital technology into the deep end, and they realized that it wasn't that deep, and the technology wasn't as overwhelming, and it wasn't something that they needed to avoid, which they had been doing for a long time. So yeah, it's been our our customers have increased dramatically from it. It's same customers, but the ones that are embracing the digital experience have grown tremendously over this time.
Okay, great, George. We'll talk more about that as we go. Tim or Andrew, what would you like to say about the use of your products during the pandemic?
Yeah, I can just build a little bit on what George said from a content angle. You know, in the immediate onset of the pandemic, VitalSource really sort of rolled out a program, you know, similar in theme to what George mentioned in terms of providing free access to digital course materials. And we had hundreds of thousands of users that were students in semester-based programs in the spring 2020 term come and take advantage of that program. We just provided free access to all textbooks that we had in our inventory to those students who were very acutely disrupted from, in some cases, getting back to their dorm room on campus and actually grabbing, you know, the textbooks that they had either purchased at the store or whatnot. And we, in terms of material impact on our business, we have had a very, you know, good share of those students who were oftentimes first time exposure to VitalSource return as customers of ours, both as direct customers, but also especially through programs that we facilitate through, you know, learning management systems. And we've noticed, you know, beyond the onset of the pandemic, you know, as last school year was underway, that despite some enrollment trends across higher education where, you know, enrollment dipped a little bit and maybe more acutely in certain profiles of institutions versus others, the you know, maybe stay an obvious point, but the share of digital content used by those students did increase, you know, rather markedly. And so, you know, an industry statistic that I've seen, which actually corroborates well with our own internal statistics around digital textbook usage, is that prior to the pandemic, you know, roughly 1 in 7 digital course materials, or 1 in 7 course materials used by students were digital, and that share increased to about a little over 1 in 5. And we've certainly seen a similar increase in the usage of our content that we distribute.
Just quickly, George, would those numbers sound about right to you as well?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
From 171. Okay. I guess, Tim, you get to hit clean up on this one and let us know what happened with your LMS. Blackboard.
Yeah, I mean, certainly directly from the LMS experience, I would say that what we have seen over the course of the pandemic, you know, is pretty well aligned with the comments from Andrew and George. You know, we definitely saw increased usage of the LMS really in all of its parameters, right? So increased number of courses, increased just overall level of usage, increased number of assets deployed into courses, really significant increases in content access. And from our perspective, you know, that can mean a number of things, whether it's, you know, a launch into an LTI tool or, you know, accessing a video recording or a PDF or PowerPoint document within the course environment. And we have certainly continued to see elevated levels of usage beyond pre-pandemic levels, but it's certainly moderated over the course of the spring and as we've, you know, really just kicked off the fall semester here in the last month. But there continues to be evidence of tool adoption at levels well above, you know, what we would have expected to see pre-pandemic.
So a quick kind of off the cuff question here for all of you or any of you that might want to answer it. I don't see you like panicking or sweating or have lost any more hair than you might have lost before the pandemic. You know, I generally get the sense that the scaling of the technology generally held up. Is that correct?
Yeah, Rob, I mean, I think you and I actually had a conversation about this, you know, kind of while we were still in the midst of all of this last summer. And, you know, I think my sense both of our performance over the last 18 months and of the industry generally is that the technology has held up to the load, and sort of, thank heavens for the cloud, right? I think it's just pretty well known that if something like this had happened in an era where we were all still deploying physical infrastructure into data centers, our ability to respond would have been much different. But I do think it has really proven out the value of both, the kind of modernization efforts that all of us have undertaken over time to get to the cloud, and just the value of the cloud computing model generally.
Mm-hmm. Anyone else want to comment on scale?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Tim. I mean, it was fortuitous for us at VitalSource that our engineering team and sort of DevOps processes were pre-pandemic already. There was already heavy investment into moving our infrastructure into a cloud-based model. I would say from a non-technical perspective, we did see a lot of increased load on our team, particularly our customer-facing team, who helped the institutions kind of ramp up the scale of the programs that we support for them, and that are digitally first programs. And we have, as a result, in the aftermath of the pandemic, had to prioritize from a product management point of view, a lot of workflow, sort of technology-enabled workflow improvements to support that increased scale, not only during the year, but including right now and going forward. And so it did, I think, reveal some pressure points on us that we're still grappling with, but certainly from a the ability in the moment to meet user demand and access the content that we are able to fulfill. Tim's absolutely right. I mean, we were fortunately well positioned to respond in that moment.
Thanks,
yeah,
Andrew.
For us, it's very similar. Kind of moons aligned in that since our sales force couldn't leave their houses, they were able to be our new training force. And so the sales team took on that role, and with Zoom and other tools that we have in-house, it was, we had webinars and training sessions throughout over the summer and through the semester. And we're seeing it now in this year's numbers, that the overall technical acumen of the higher education population is clearly much higher, because our call volume is down by almost 25%. So it's an interesting thing how it's gone through. It's definitely I think everybody got a little more comfortable with the technology in the classroom.
So next, thank you, George. So the next question is really kind of the key question for all of you, and it's maybe too early to tell, but everyone in education is talking about, let's get back to the way things were, that sort of thing, which of course is a natural reaction to something like the pandemic. And in fact, some of our commentators and other talks and panels in this conference have been saying, well, they're disappointed. We're not doing enough in terms of thinking about how things have changed and how they should change and so forth. But what do you think, from where you sit, right, in terms of, do these scale ups persist now? And exactly what happens do you think going forward, especially now, given, right, the lot more comfort probably with using these technologies, right? What would be your estimate? Who would like to take that one?
And I can give a perspective.
Oh, go ahead.
Oh, sorry.
Go ahead, Andrew.
I can just give a perspective in terms of a type of program that we power at hundreds of institutions across the country, which is known as inclusive access programs. I'm sure many in the audience are familiar with that. And for those who aren't, typically, at least among the institutions that we serve with, or for which we power inclusive access programs, it's a digital first program where instructors are opting into having the course materials that they've adopted for their class be accessed digitally as a primary mode of course materials distribution. And students can choose to opt in or opt out of those those programs. We have seen, so post-pandemic we're coming out of what we call, and I don't think this term is necessarily unique to us, but we're just coming out of our fall 2021 rush season where, the gigantic amount of business is sort of generated for us in activity. And we, at least proportionally, compared to over the other months of the year. And we have found, based on kind of an internal metric that we use, which we kind of dub in digital saturation, that the amount, the share or the proportion of course materials that are used as digital materials on campus, across a given campus where we're running an IA program, has increased still, even with students returning, back to sort of more of a normal environment, where they're not, where they are actually physically on campus, where the campus bookstore may be, available to walk in and, pick up books, physical books off the shelf or whatnot. And so it has, we continue to see that. And I think the indicators of that are twofold. Number one, instructors must choose to participate, right? So they can, in working with our bookstore partners, they can say, we're not interested in this program. And then we've had an increasing percentage of instructors say that they want to participate. And then likewise, student opt-in rates have increased as well. And so I think that's an indicator to us, at least in the immediate term, that the scale up will continue.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very interesting. Tim, George?
Yeah, George, you were trying to get in there. Go ahead.
Yeah. So we're seeing the same thing. I think last summer, schools were still trying to work out their budgets. They didn't know what enrollment was going to be like. And as we were trying to help them talk about new ways, hey, we're going to be online, there's things we can do, they were really struggling to understand, what was their budget going to be? How many instructors could they have? How's this whole thing going to work? I think this summer we've really started to see committees being spun up that are talking about, all right, now that we've all survived, the students are coming back, maybe a little bit less than we had hoped, but still healthy enrollments, how they can teach differently. So I think that has really started to change. How do you utilize, how do you use it for accessibility? Students who don't have the ability to get to a classroom or a different area, that this is another way for them to be able to do that. So I think could be a whole topic in itself, but just the change of the teaching styles are definitely, we're starting to see it. And I think it's early stages in the exploratory phase of how can I teach chemistry in a different way, where I can teach more students without building another lab, another building to increase my enrollment. And the blended classroom really does allow them to get much more efficient with their physical assets, while they're making it much more accessible to a broader population.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Tim, any comments on?
Yeah, I mean, all of that resonates quite a bit with me. I mean, to go back to, the core of the question you asked, Rob, is sort of, things changed rapidly because they had to. How much of that change is going to stick, and to what degree are, people just going to bounce back to pre-pandemic normal, right? And I think as much as students and instructors and and parents are eager to get people back into physical environments and into classrooms, I really do think there's something really important about that element that we've mentioned of just the increased level of comfort with the technology, and that there are a lot of instructors, institutions that maybe were hesitant to really deeply adopt digital assets and virtual classroom environments, that have now had that experience. And I think as time goes on, that really is going to represent a continued fundamental shift in sort of the blend of digital versus physical that we see, right? And that, how do I take all the tools available to me, whether it's a physical asset like a classroom or digital assets and those sort of things, and really create the best blended instructional experience that can be created. And we do see in our our advisory groups, the clients we work with, that institutions are being very thoughtful about that. And there maybe has been a little bit of a bounce back to okay, well, let's go back and do things the way we used to as much as we can while we figure this out. But there's definitely an enhanced interest in really looking at how to take the experience of the pandemic and take the best parts of them and integrate them into a better experience moving forward.
That's kind of, thanks, Tim. That's kind of where we wanted to go next with the discussion in terms of the new models. We actually already have a comment in the chat that basically says, yeah, the pandemic kind of accelerated some of the ideas about new models that maybe we were already thinking about, whether it's the blended models or the hybrid models or now the high flex, models. And in talking about where the LMS or the LMS category needs to go in the future, seems like that's a pretty important consideration, right? In terms of what happens where, what the role of the LMS is in the situation where, well, the students really can be anywhere. They can come to class if they want, or they can be at home if they want, or, they can use digital materials if they want, or they can use some other materials if they want. I would think that would be something that your organizations are thinking a lot about in terms of where that might go. So let's just open that up and start talking about it.
That's I mean, I think this is the biggest change that's happened, which at a school pre-pandemic, a school would be a Blackboard school or an pick the LMS. They all typically had one or two or three. But when we saw it, because we would sit down and we were helping them with all their courses, that the actual usage of that LMS was waning. And the biggest thing we saw with pandemic is that a school that was a Blackboard school, Wayne Community College was one that I talked to them extensively. They said, oh yeah, we've always had it, we've never used it. Now we're all using it. And this change where I can depend that it's there completely changes my product roadmaps. That there were certain things that I used to have to do because I couldn't guarantee that the LMS was kind of ubiquitous and it was there. I've always thought of it as the plumbing of the school, that it's the hallways. And when you step into a classroom, it may be a homegrown classroom that a professor did inside Blackboard, or it was one that we curated for them. But they always go back to the hallway to get to their next class. And so that if it could really be that way and have the LMS be a dependable thing that every class is there, then it really helps us create a much simpler experience. And so we've just launched a new product that is just that. It's our experience inside the Blackboard, inside the LMS, with the idea that the student doesn't realize they're leaving the LMS, even though they are going into our experiences. And so I think that's going to be really promising going forward.
Yeah, I totally agree, George. And that really does, again, match up with what we've seen in terms of, those adoption trends that I was discussing. Rob, I think an important thing here, and I'll go back to your comment about the NGDLE, which is also not my favorite acronym, but it's known. I think what we've learned here in part is that the sort of the traditional boundaries of the LMS are necessary but not sufficient for the teaching and learning needs of today's institutions, right? And so, it is very core, and that consistent adoption represents a real opportunity for us to create better student experiences and more consistent experiences for students. But it's also incredibly important that we saw certainly over the last year the importance of the virtual classroom environment, and it's a place where we saw incredible increases in usage and adoption beyond what we saw in the LMS. Was in Blackboard Collaborate, our virtual classroom environment, where we saw orders of magnitude of increased usage. And so I think there is opportunity to think about the learning environment more broadly, to include both, again, sort of the traditional boundaries of the LMS paired with a virtual classroom environment that's actually designed for education and that meets those teaching and learning use cases explicitly. And then I think that this gets us to where the role of the IMS is critical, is the importance of LTI and continuing to mature and grow the LTI standard to allow us to create really well-integrated, seamless, best of breed experiences that start from the LMS, but can extend in a multitude of directions, whether it's to, a digital asset for content, a specialized virtual learning environment for STEM or for programs like nursing. And there's a whole multitude of things where, again, the LMS, I think it's much more important for us to think about the LMS as the hub of that learning experience rather than as the totality of that learning experience.
Yeah, and I would add, or sorry, just to add quickly to what Jordan said. Yeah. I guess I offer two thoughts. One, both with my sort of professional hat on, thinking about higher ed, and then more personal, thinking about secondary education. So, we have long looked at the LMS as a prime access point for the content that we distribute, and sort of the fundamental assumption and fundamental operating principle around the inclusive access programs that I mentioned earlier is that the LMS is the entry point and sort of the delivery or launch point, if you will, to access the content that we're providing for those programs. And citing the scale that I mentioned earlier, we don't envision that that's likely to change, and certainly in the near term. On a more personal note, so my wife is a high school teacher who is, a veteran teacher, and was definitely thrown in the deep end of the pool last year. And what I've noticed, actually, interestingly, in this year, and I happened to see it with my students who are high school students as well, or my children who are high school students as well, is that even though they've returned to the classroom, there's, at least in my wife's case, there's a lot of, I think, conscious planning on her part to still grapple with the realities of COVID. And even though we happen to live in a community where there's not a lot of or not a high case rate these days, relatively speaking, she's still very conscious about getting her students out of the classroom, utilizing her classroom time, the physical plan of the campus, in ways where they can do more individual student collaboration, or I'm sorry, group collaboration as individual students, and be sort of in a sort of more safe environment from a physical, sort of proximity perspective, and leverage the technology that she had to leverage last year and some of the recorded instruction and whatnot with her students outside of the actual time block, or at least as a different chunk of the time block that she has with her students physically in class. And so I do think it's changed her teaching. I've noticed my children do see effectively lectures from their teachers at home when they're doing their homework and whatnot. And that's certainly an increased pace compared to what they did pre-pandemic.
So I'll bring in, I'd like to dive a little deeper into this topic and see if we can be more specific, because I think it'll help the audience maybe understand what all of you have in mind in terms of what this future looks like. And maybe as an example, I'll just bring up that in a panel right after this one, I'll be talking to K-12, largely K-12 suppliers, although not exclusively. They also have products in higher ed that are more focused, more what you would call app portals, or integration as a service type providers, right? And these products are very popular in K-12 because they're the model for access, and very important during the pandemic, because the model for access is very much like what it is when you use Apple, apps or Google apps or whatever. There's a dashboard and there's a bunch of apps, and the teacher or the student just clicks on it, and then they go, and it's rostered in some way, and then they go into that app. Totally separate experiences in the apps themselves, but all the apps are very easy to get to because they are, in a single place, right? And they can be accessed the same way from mobile or what have you. Now, in high, and there is, the interesting point I wanted to bring up is that despite the wide availability of these types of products in K-12, the LMS is rising in importance in K-12 during the pandemic and now after the pandemic. It was already sort of starting, and now it's increasing. Because why? Because that kind of access, that collaboration or orchestration between the different applications can be more intentional, right? Made more intentional now. But, you know, so it makes me wonder, and I don't know the answer to this too, and I spend a lot of time thinking about this too, but, you know, at one point in time, and sorry for talking so much, but I think it will help the discussion. At one point in time, we had this vision of the future LMS. In fact, it came up with our famous colleague, Dr. Charles Severance at the University of Michigan, which is that, well, the LMS is just like a window that floats on top of every application that the student goes into. And it's the thing that kind of connects them seamlessly across all those applications. And it just sort of, you know, handles the stuff that goes back and forth between all those applications, right? That was a pretty appealing vision, I thought, and he actually built a mock-up of it and so forth. You know, to me, that was kind of an NGDLE. So is that the kind of thing, you know, for instance, George, that you have in mind when you say, you know, keep the customer or within the Cengage experience, or are you talking more about leveraging more of the existing features in the LMS that exist today so that, you know, there are more access points within the existing LMS today of where your content can be accessed and found and maybe even go across courses or classes? I just thought if we got more specific, people would get
I mean, the way our vision is that the LMS is the content hub. And so it is the place where we're going. I think we have work to do to expand the integration capabilities between those so that it can be more seamless. So I think our vision is that the student shouldn't feel the rough edges of going from one provider to another product to another provider. I think from a standards body, something I think that we need to do is come up with a more uniform identity management where a student is a canonical record of a student that we all know who this person is, and that can transcend schools and systems and different things. So that's one of the things that's really, you know, the number of passwords a student has to memorize is just, it's creating tremendous friction. But no, what we see is that if the LMS can be the hallways of the virtual classroom, then when you walk into the room, it shouldn't be a jarring experience, and students shouldn't feel the difference between that. We want to be able to add value and add different experiences, but we would like those experiences to be integrated into the student's workflow, that this makes sense to them. They don't have 3 grade books. They don't have, you know, the ability to be able to kind of curate that experience holistically, not just in individual pieces, is where we see things going in the future. And for us, you had to get adoption of the LMS first for us to have that. A lot of the stuff that we've brought to market over the last 10 years was because a lot of students were, or instructors weren't using the LMS. So I had to create a grade book. So now we have 2 grade books, and we have, when we do integrate with the LMS, how do we start going through those things? So because we had partial adoption of these tools, once we get kind of full adoption from an institution, that every class has a LMS node, and then we have a better way to integrate with that node and a better way to share the student information between suppliers of that node, then I think we can create a much more, you know, we can focus on learning instead of navigating passwords and screens and tabs and what have you.
Right. So it sounds like this is a less of a course by course experience, right? And more of some sort of where the LMS is providing some integration across courses, right? And in some way, shape, like that's the analogy of the hallways or what have you, right? It could be more than that.
Yeah,
right?
I think once you're in the class, the different providers should be able to provide different experiences within it. But from an end user, you didn't realize it didn't all come from Blackboard. And so Blackboard can't deliver everything, but we can pretend, we can make it look like they did, so the student doesn't have to figure out different nomenclatures, different processes, different things.
Yeah, George, that all makes a ton of sense to me. And, you know, Rob, all deference to my friend Dr. Chuck, who I have great respect for. I do think that, you know, there is a difference between, you know, sort of, I think what's envisioned to be sort of an application portal, and that doesn't do justice to the value that the LMS can provide. I totally agree with George that, you know, there should be the ability to plug in, you know, whatever set of tools are best fit to purpose for that instructional experience. We do have work to do to make those transitions between applications more seamless and those things. But, you know, I think that the LMS has been and should continue to be far more than sort of just the hallway, because this is about more than, you know, sort of shared rostering and I can go find the thing I need in the app store. You know, certainly the grade center is incredibly important, and the ability to post, you know, grades from multiple tools into a centralized grade book to you know, just reduce toil for the instructor. And I think the ability to do thoughtful orchestration of content and, you know, really instructional design at the course level, and particularly in an environment where, and this is maybe more applicable at the higher ed level, where instructors are combining elements of content from multiple sources, right? They've maybe adopted a set of Cengage assets, but they're supplementing those with things that they've created personally, with other digital assets and other experiences. And the ability to orchestrate that and organize that material and apply things like, you know, adaptive release, where the instructor can design a path through the material for a student and provide gating along the way to make sure that they're sort of mastering concept one before they jump too deep into concept two, right? Those are all key parts of the value proposition of the LMS. And I think something very different than really that, you know, sort of, I don't know what to call it, that sort of more agnostic vision of we just need a place where you can get to all the apps and do single sign-on, right?
Okay. Andrew, you have any thoughts on that one?
No, I mean, just real quickly, I'd just say that we believe that the user experience that we provide with the LMS is the gateway to our learning environments, whether it's, you know, our e-reader application bookshelf or our courseware platform Acrobatic is a superior experience overall than just the straight access from the app portals. And we do certainly a much higher percentage of our user base is higher education versus K-12, but we do fulfill content through the common app portals in K-12, and just the capabilities that the LMS provides that both George and Tim, you know, described, you know, set the foundation for that superior user experience.
Right. Okay. So the interesting question that comes to my mind as I hear you folks talk is really, do you have any inkling on whether the, you know, higher ed in particular, since we're kind of focused on higher ed here, the institutional leaders themselves, the faculty, or the sort of folks from institutions that show up in the IMS meetings, you know, the leaders of academic technology and so forth, you think they would? Do you think you're getting any sense that they have a similar vision or the same vision? And you know, to me, that was sort of the value of the NGDLE, is there's quite a lot of work done there to try to get input, you know, from quite a lot of the institutional folks. And I think everything we've talked about here is potentially along those lines, but I'm just sort of wondering, you know, do you sense that this would be well accepted by the faculty or the instructional, you know, technology leadership at the institutions you work with, this kind of new direction or future direction?
You know, I think increasingly so, Rob. And again, I don't know that this is, you know, I don't know that this is so much new as it is that we're reaching the point where we can really realize the the promise and the vision that I think much of the industry has had in mind for some time. And, you know, at least in my interactions with institutional leaders and technology leaders, both within and outside the IMS, and, you know, the instructional design community, you know, first of all, again, we've said it before, that more consistent adoption becomes really important, right? Because to the degree that the institution can provide a more consistent experience across the students' range of courses and interactions, that's going to improve retention and improve outcomes and all sorts of things, right? But I think that, you know, really the two things primarily that the instructional community wants are, you know, sort of efficient, easy to use tools and flexibility to plug in whatever they want to plug in to extend or in some way supplement that experience. And again, I think the work that all of us have made a lot of progress on, but there's more work to do, is to really making that a reality, and making sure that power of the existing workflows within the LMS is, as you know, as Andrew said, improving the experience that a tool provider can provide by integrating into that experience.
Mm-hmm. Sounds like a lot of LTI deep linking kind of stuff for those of you that are familiar with IMS standards. But what other, is that true, or are there other, you know, do you guys have any? Obviously, we'll be talking a lot about this, and I appreciate kind of the firm insight here from all of you on this direction. I think it will help us going forward in IMS. But any thoughts on the standards that are most important relative to this type of vision?
I mean, we've been a huge advocate and driver of LTI, so I can't say enough about that. To us, the next mountain to climb is this identity side. That when we see students, you know, I see students who are in two different schools. They're registered, so they're in two different LMSs. And they're going through, and if you sit down and watch a workflow of a student, they've got a Barnes & Noble account, they have a school account, they have a Cengage account, and they're trying to know, where do I put the right identity in the right place? So I think this is something that hasn't been solved, and I think can be a big unlock. When we talk to institutions, they, you know, the two big things that they focus on with us is ease of use and affordability. And I think to really tackle this ease of use piece, unfortunately, as we're trying to change and digital is becoming more ubiquitous, all of our user management systems are banging into each other. And so I think there's a chance for us to look at how to, I mean, a student is a student is a student. So it's a person. How do we identify that in our system so that they can nicely transition across the different business and many business models at the same time?
Yeah, and George, I think that's a great comment, and that concept of a digital student record is one that I think is important for us to pursue it as an industry, in a place where the IMS can provide a lot of leadership, because I very much am of the point of view that we're in this kind of place in the industry right now, and this sort of evolving level of maturity, where the view to that kind of data exchange is, well, yeah, we can pass the roster data around, but when it comes to being sort of like the system of record, every vendor almost is in a place where they're saying, well, I'm happy to take your data into my data lake, but I don't so much want to give you mine. Right. Yeah. And we have to get beyond that mentality to get to a place where we're truly gonna solve that problem and create the value that we could be creating, you know, for all of us to actually unlock the wealth of data that's out there, and use it in ways that are actually beneficial to the student's learning journey and the instructional experience.
Yeah. Andrew, looks like you might get the last word if you have a comment on that.
Yeah, I mean, I guess just to build a little bit on what George and Tim were saying. I mean, I even extend a little bit to beyond even user identity. I mean, one of the challenges that we face that's a really hard nut for us to crack is, a value that we add to the market is that we're able to be a partner to the institution, help provide access to students and faculty to a wide variety of content providers. And increasingly we provide, like personalized sort of dashboards of what is it that a student needs for a given term across all of their classes. And this is, powers these inclusive access experiences that I mentioned, or even at a higher scale, an equitable access program that we partnered with UC Davis that won a Learning Impact Award this year. At the heart of it, actually, the expressions of courses and course identities between LMSs and actual other source data systems that are used on campus, student information systems, et cetera, and sort of the transposing of those identities make the actual presentation of a personalized view of your course, of all of the course materials you need across all of your courses, a very complex technical challenge, and also a very laborious sort of workflow challenge for us. And so I think the theme that George and Tim, just kind of teased out here is definitely something that we are going to need to, as an industry, collaborate on to help solve, because it is where at least we see a decent amount of friction around just providing these experiences that customers now demand.
Okay, thanks, Andrew. We're going to have to call it quits because our time is up. But I do really want to thank the panel. I think we've got some really interesting use cases, call to action around this specifically, and for me and for IMS, and appreciate that. Appreciate all your insights. You're all stars, and keep up the good work. And for all you viewers out there, I hope you can tune into other sessions, and I hope to see you real soon in one of those. Take care.